All right. So, yeah, today we're here to talk about helping teens respond to difficult emotions. And my name is Annie. I work with Domestic Violence Services of Snohomish County as the North County Prevention Coordinator. And here with me, so lucky to have her, is one of my favorite people, Tanya Keenan. If you want to introduce yourself.
Hi, Annie. Thank you so much. So my name's Tanya Keenan. I am a mental health clinician at Compass Health. I work through the Everett Children and Families Clinic, and I work in partnership with Cocoon House. So I work with a lot of youth in transition, youth without homes, and I've been working with Cocoon House for about 4 years now. And I've been working with homeless and at-risk youth in this general area in Western Washington for about 8 years, but overall for, doing math, 19 years. So I started out in California. So I am really happy to be here. I've loved working with Annie, so.
Yeah, awesome. We're gonna have Tanya is so knowledgeable about all of this stuff. I'm so glad she was able to be here today because she has so much insight that I don't have because I was like a teenager 5 years ago. So make a great team.
Yes, we do. All right, well, I guess we can get started. I love this quote, and this is Annie's quote, so I'm gonna let you read it, Annie.
Okay, so from Chang Ray Lee, for no matter the shadows of an age, the picture of a young couple in love, we are told, speaks most luminously of the future, as the span of that passion makes us believe we can overleap any walls, obliterate whatever obstacles. And I wanted to start out with this quote because it does talk about how powerful young love is and young relationships, because from an outside perspective, they can seem a bit dramatic, a bit silly. You know, you might hear a lot of statements like, she's the love of my life and we're going to be together forever, or I just know he's the one. And, you know, it's sweet. It's really sweet. And I don't think that we should let that get lost on us as we're talking about teenage relationships.
That's beautiful. Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the internal world of a teenager. So at puberty, teenagers go through an enormous amount of change, and this is probably familiar to a lot of you. There are massive hormonal changes, and as an example, testosterone in boys or assigned male at birth increases by about tenfold. It's pretty massive. Yes. And so like when I talk about hormonal changes, I'm not talking about like small incremental changes. I'm talking about massive earth-shattering changes. And I'm sure that those of you who work with teens or have teenagers at home really get this. So in addition to those kind of biological changes that are happening, there's a ton of social stress and pressure that teenagers experience. There's, you know, the pressures from their peers. There's the pressure of expectation, various expectations from different parts of their world. And then they also have to contend with the idea that in a few years or next year or whatever, they're going to have to be adults and be independent. And that is a whole lot of pressure. And so part of that transition from childhood to adulthood, part of those social stresses and pressures is the introduction of relationships. And of course, hormones also affect that. Yeah, absolutely. And I have a metaphor that I like to use for what it's like in the teenage brain. And I want you to think of those HGTV shows where they gut a house and completely remodel it. And that is the teenage brain, right? All of the wiring's ripped out. The floors are ripped up and the walls are coming down and being reorganized. And, the basic bones are there, but boy, everything else is kind of a mess, and there's dust and debris. And yes, that's the teenage brain. So it's a lot. And I could go on with that metaphor, but I think it's myself.
Oh, that is definitely like such a good point. And like, working with teenagers, even just the crazy vast differences between a 13-year-old and a 17-year-old.
My goodness, yes.
They're in the same age range, but it's weird to think like, especially when in the past I've worked with like 13-year-olds they were 10 3 years ago, and that difference is huge. There's so much going on, so many different changes in school. That jump from even elementary school to middle school, of being treated like a child into starting having these responsibilities, and the social cliques that form, and then even the expectation of romantic relationships that's when that starts to come in. We're about to talk about that a little bit more. So I got ahead of myself. We're going to talk about emotional intensity.
That's okay. It was a good introduction. So with all these hormonal changes comes a real physiological change in how they experience emotion. And so it becomes super intense. And I don't know if any of you remember being teenagers. I remember being a teenager, even though it was like forever ago. But how deeply I felt things, and how intensely I felt them. But these intense emotions require skills to process and skills to express appropriately. And then these skills are learned through observation. They observe their entire world. They observe family, they observe their friends and how they experience, how they relate to other people. And they learn through media. And it sounds like you guys just recently had a social media webinar. So that's awesome. Like, it's super important. That's a huge influence these days. So, and then some youth also face unique challenges in learning how to handle their emotions, including the experience of trauma. So, we can't underplay that the role that trauma can have in forming people's relationships. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
Yeah, absolutely. And mental health struggles, youth who are neurodivergent.
Yes.
And youth, just like, there's so many different factors going into play, and you put that on top of these hormones and these new emotions that are so intense, and that it can just be really difficult to navigate through life like that.
Yeah.
So yeah, these emotions are of course coming into play as youth are starting their first romantic relationships for many of them, which can be pretty crazy. I do like to tell when I'm talking to youth that relationships are skills. And so there's a chance that your first few relationships might be kind of toxic sometimes, because you haven't learned how to engage, you haven't learned how to manage conflict, you haven't set boundaries about how much time you want to spend together, emotional boundaries, physical boundaries yet. These are all things that they're having to figure out, and it can be really scary and really rocky too in the beginning. And of course, these relationships are going to bring up some really intense and really complex emotions that these youth might be feeling for the first times in their lives. And then also, just like with how they deal with emotions, how they handle emotions in their relationships is something that they're learning from their family and that they're learning from their friends. And so they're coming from an environment where conflicts are handled with yelling or with threats, or there's not a lot of safe ways of expressing emotions. Then that's what they're gonna see as normal, and that's where they might bring that into their first relationships. And again, the kind of media that they're watching and how their friends are involving relationships, those are all going to influence what kind of conflict resolutions they have and how they express themselves when they go into their romantic relationships.
Exactly. And yeah, so I think Annie, you just hit all the points there. If whatever has been normalized for them in their childhood is really how they're going to approach their first relationships. And it's which is why modeling is so important, which is why external supports are so important, to help youth learn how to navigate, I mean, any sort of relationship, but particularly romantic ones. But I don't want to underplay the media influence as well. If you want to go to the next slide, Annie, I want to really bring to attention, there's something going on right now in the media, which is the divorce between Kim Kardashian and Kanye West, and the domestic violence allegations that have happened, and the domestic abuse that occurred in that relationship, that occurred in front of the world. I mean, this relationship was all over the place. And I know a lot of youth who watched the Kardashians on TV. And so all of this was kind of played out. And I really wanted to draw attention to this meme that I saw. It just made such a really good point that said, if someone saw someone talk about how if Kim Kardashian, with all the money and resources in the world, can't safely and simply divorce her husband without being harassed and stalked, and it's about time we stop asking women in domestic violence situations the question, why doesn't she just leave? And here we're talking about two adults. So those hormone levels have leveled off, right? But we have a lot of really intense teenagers watching how this plays out. So have they normalized abuse that they've seen on TV that has been romanticized? And, you know, we can talk about Twilight, and there were a ton of movies in the 80s and stuff, or I think in the 90s and beyond, that romanticize behavior that is really not okay, that is really unhealthy, and crosses boundaries. So a lot of people get their ideas from these sources. And I do remember having a conversation with youth about the movie Suicide Squad, and about the really toxic relationship between Harley Quinn and Joker. One of our youth, we were having a group about it, and one of our youth said, yeah, but I'd really love to have somebody in my life that was ride or die like that. And a bunch of people agreed. And I thought, of course, we also had another teenager look at me like, is this really happening? And so, some were more aware, but that intensity of the emotion is really something that they crave. And I think that that's what kind of blocks their judgment about things like this. So anyway, I wanted to bring up those examples about like how powerful those influences can be. I saw somebody in the chat. Yes. Yeah, Chris, that's a really good point. This makes the point in the chat. Where Kanye says, I ain't never seen the papers. We're not even divorced. He said, adding, that ain't no joke. My kids want their parents to stay together. I want us to be together. Yeah. So, and as youth see these kinds of things played out and said in public, in the public square, then that can be really terrifying.
Absolutely. And just looking at, because really so many of these behaviors are products of people poorly managing their emotions. Like, we're going to talk about heartbreak and a divorce, especially for someone who doesn't necessarily want the relationship and can have so many hard emotions with it. But the way that it's being portrayed, or the way that, it's being handled in this relationship is not a healthy way. It's a very harmful, and it's a very scary way that he's handling these emotions, that it's for the world to see. And, we need to be condemning that. We need to be letting people know, like, no, that is not an okay way to go about a divorce. That's not an okay way to go about ending a relationship. If somebody does not want to be married to you anymore, then that is their choice, and they have a right to say that, and they have a right to not be in that relationship anymore. So on this topic, something really important in the prevention department, and we work a lot with youth talking about these topics, talking about relationships and their emotions in relationships, is that emotions are not good or bad. We never want to say, oh, you shouldn't feel angry about this. You shouldn't feel jealous. You shouldn't have anxiety in your relationship, because they're going to feel that. No one's ever stopped feeling something just because someone told them they shouldn't feel it. And so we want to make sure they know that it's okay to have those feelings. But the way we choose to behave and what we choose to do with our feelings, that is very important. Being angry isn't a bad thing, but using that anger to lash out and to harm your partner is not good. It's harmful, and we don't want youth to, or anybody to be doing that with their feelings. And we also really make sure to emphasize that just because you're angry, you're jealous, you're scared, that's never an excuse to have harmful or controlling behavior towards someone. Your emotions are not excusing your behavior. We're all responsible for our feelings. And it's going along with that, it's also really important that we give alternatives, because it's not enough to say, if you're angry, you shouldn't yell and scream. We need to say, if you're angry, here's an appropriate way to handle that. It's always important to say, here's what you can do, instead of just saying, here's what you can't do.
Right. And I know with so many of the youth that I work with, and I know that that's a subset of youth. I realize that, but I know so many of the youth that I work with have not had that modeling, have not had it modeled how to deal with difficult emotions. So anger is dealt with very poorly. Guilt is dealt with very poorly. Jealousy is, dealt with by lashing out and striking back and things like that. So it's just so important to get these messages out. And of course, those images are also very present in the media. And I'm like a media junkie, so I don't want to say that like media is terrible, but I'm kind of a pop culture fan. But yeah, sometimes it has like some weird messaging, and we need to just be aware. And they're actually great opportunities for discussion.
Yeah, and there's also really great examples of positive emotional regulation in relationships and media too. I think, Tanya, you had a really good example the other day, right?
I did, yeah. So, and especially this is an example of a relationship between teenagers. But for those of you who are Star Trek fans, in the latest Star Trek show called Star Trek Discovery, there are two teenagers, and one is non-binary and the other one's transgender. And they have this beautiful, caring relationship, and it's deeply intense. There's trauma involved in the relationship, right? They've had traumatic things happen to them in the course of their relationship, but they are very gentle with each other. They're very clear. They have hard conversations. But I just want, I would love all of the kids that I work with to watch this, to see how it's done. This is how it's done. And this is how you can have conflict or differing opinions and still be loving and kind and considerate to the other partner. But I just really love that it's two teenagers having these conversations and having this relationship play out.
Yeah, no, it's so important to have good role models of that in TV. I'd love to see examples of that. You must be the coolest counselor. Kids come in and you're like, all right, today we're watching Star Trek.
I'll play them. I'll have them watch Star Trek and we'll listen to rap music together. And but yeah, it's I like using media because I know that that's something that they get exposed to.
Yeah, definitely. And if anyone else can think of some great examples of like good TV couples, definitely put it in the chat. Or if you've even seen in your life, like have a story where you noticed a kid expressing their emotions really well and handling a really intense like conflict well, or intense emotions well, love to hear some stories about that too.
Yeah, so, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, so this is something that Tanya and I actually came up with together when we were doing a joint thing at Cocoon House, the challenging emotions chart. And I think it's cool because it's both challenging emotions because they're difficult and challenging them in like the verb sort of sense.
Right, yeah.
I wasn't sure how to put that right. But so the way it works is you take emotion that comes up in a relationship, and then what are some toxic behaviors that this emotion might like encourage people to do, you know, or that it might influence. And then what are some healthy ways that that same emotion could be expressed in a relationship? So we're going to start off with an example, guilty.
All right, so we're starting off with guilty, and what we could do is look first at the toxic ways we have either seen guiltiness or guilt played out or handled in a relationship from wherever, from family, from people's behavior that we know, from TV and media. And so we came up with a few options for toxic behavior. And we came up with denial of wrongdoing, right? No, it wasn't me. Shifting blame, right? So this idea of shifting the blame to the other person, right? You made me do this, right? And Annie, you came up with a really good one, which we called manipulative appeasement. Bit of a mouthful, but you explained it really well, if you want.
Yeah, it's, I'm sure there's a better word. It just wasn't coming to our heads, but where you apologize so much and make such a big deal out of it and have how guilty that you feel that the other person ends up going, whoa, 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 hold on. It's not that big of a deal. I'm not actually that upset about it. It's okay. And it kind of is a way to get around really dealing with the issue by causing guilt for the other person about your own guilty feelings. And the other one is lying to hide your mistake, trying to cover up what you did so they don't find out about it. Someone said guilt bombing, and
it's a great one.
That's a great term. That's a new term. But yeah, and these are all, you know, behaviors that are not good ways of handling guilt in a relationship, but they also make sense depending on where somebody's coming from. If they come from a family where if they make a mistake, they get in trouble and somebody gets very, very upset with them, and there's a very scary reaction to that, then when they go into their relationships, they're going to not really know how to handle that guilt. They're not going to really know how to take accountability for that because of those past experiences. They haven't had that opportunity to grow into doing that.
Right. And, you know, we can't understate the importance of understanding generational trauma in this context, because people can be learning, young folks can be learning so much from previous generations, and the generational patterns, generational trauma can just continue to affect how people behave. And if you, I'll give you another media example. One that is pretty recent, and that's Encanto, which is Disney's Encanto, which is all about generational trauma. And how, if you look at the way everybody handles conflict and upsetting emotions in the film, it really all comes from this traumatic origin. So for those of you who haven't seen it, I strongly encourage you to do so. It's there's a lot of people in the therapeutic community who are talking about this movie.
I haven't seen it yet, but I'll definitely check it out. Maybe we'll get some more good clips for our future presentations on media. So yeah, those are some toxic ways that it might be shown. And then we also have some healthy ways. So if you're feeling guilty in a relationship, say you made a mistake, made a joke that hurt somebody's feelings a lot more than it was meant to, and you can tell, some healthy ways of dealing that would be remorse, expressing, oh, I'm sorry, and showing them that you feel bad about it. Taking accountability, letting them know, I made that joke and I understand that it hurts your feelings and I'm sorry, and changing your behavior. I'm not going to make jokes like that in the future, and seeking support if it's something more serious that happened. If you did something that you're really ashamed of, then it's not always easy for us to change our behaviors alone. And so encouraging youth to seek help for an issue. Maybe they have some trouble with anger, with dealing with their anger. They don't have to do that alone. And one conversation won't exactly help with that all of the time. So encouraging them to seek counseling.
Yes, I was telling Annie that I think pretty much all teenagers should be in counseling. That I think it's just such a huge support. It can be a huge support, and I know that that also has been problematic for some teenagers. I want to recognize that too. But there are some really, it's just so hard to navigate everything at that age. So what we'd like to, oh, go ahead.
I would go so far as to expand that to everybody should be in counseling.
Yes.
I don't think there's enough counselors out there for that.
No, probably not. What we'd like to do now is invite everyone to participate in some of in engaging in some of these charts. And so we've already done guilt, but now we're going to talk about anger and how to handle anger. So we would love to have you just brainstorm into the chat. We can talk first about toxic behavior. So what are some toxic behaviors around anger and how to handle that? Okay, we have yelling and screaming. Yes. Yeah, which can be terrifying. Lashing at the other person and putting them down. Yes, so yep, throwing things and physical violence. Yeah, it's all coming in. Name calling. So we have physical reactions. We have emotional abusive reactions, name calling. And yes, like even if somebody throws something that is not even at the other person, then that too can be terrifying. And yes, exactly, projecting your own stuff onto the other person or their own stuff onto the other person. Being over controlling and possessive or accusatory, exactly. So those are really, really toxic ways of handling anger. And I'm sure we see plenty of the examples of those, both in life and in media. But let's switch it up a little bit And let's talk about healthy ways of handling anger. So what are some healthy things that we can do when we're angry? Either by coaching, and we can talk about coaching youth or modeling these behaviors for youth.
Taking space to calm and then talking it out.
That's a good one.
Always recommend taking space. That's so important. Deep breaths, because we know that we know that when we're angry, there's so much going on, and that it can be such a huge difference of just taking even just a few seconds thinking before you respond, because I know I personally have just that oh really, I get defensive and I'm just like, okay, take a minute, Annie, take a minute. And it always goes better. Conversations always go better when you take a minute to think about what you have to say.
Yes. And, somebody mentioned deep breaths too. Thank you, Emma. That from a physiological standpoint, doing some deep breathing gets oxygen back into the brain, back into the prefrontal cortex, which gets it working again. So when we get angry, our limbic system, right, kicks in and kind of shuts off the prefrontal cortex. So we're not thinking. And that is especially true in teenagers. They just stop thinking. So that's a really great point. So we have lots of others. Letting your partner know that you're upset and you want to talk about it. Removing yourself from the situation. Identifying a specific behavior that makes you angry and not making broad character judgments of the other person. Thank you, Jeff. That's a really good point. Having specific things is really important. And then also consulting with an adult for their guidance before confronting their significant other. Also really good. And so we want to make sure that, youth have a healthy adult to consult. So these are really awesome suggestions. Thank you. So I think we're going to do a couple others if everybody's up for it.
Yeah, and I do want to say before we move on from anger, that anger is, often talked about sometimes, especially among women, as oh, you shouldn't feel angry. Angry is bad. But like we said, anger is morally neutral, and it's also important because anger lets us know if there's an injustice or if we're being mistreated. And sometimes if, for some people it could be wrong, it could be, it's a normal situation, but they're hypersensitive to it or they're misinterpreting it. But if your partner does something that's hurting you, or if your friend has really betrayed your trust, then listening to that anger and letting listening to that anger and listening to the message that you've been wronged, and then instead of being reactionary towards that, which you might want to yell at them or punish them in some way, taking a step back and saying, how do I actually want to address this in a way that's going to be beneficial for our relationship instead of causing harm to it.
Right. And DBT also talks a lot about what the evolutionary purposes of certain emotions, and the purpose of anger is that to indicate that there's a need for change.
Yeah, that's really awesome. I also loved hearing about the emotions in the breathing in your frontal cortex. I did not know that. I didn't know that your brain actually isn't thinking when you're upset.
Oh, yeah. When you're upset like that, and your cortisol rises and your adrenaline rises and your prefrontal cortex nopes right out of there. So oxygen is the invitation to come back. And oh, good. Jealousy. This is a great one.
Yeah, jealousy is a great one. And it's something that we talk a lot about when we talk about dating violence, because jealousy is really a common thing in abusive relationships.
Yes. And, it's a common thing in relationships, especially in new relationships when, youth don't have they haven't developed their own personal boundaries, much less figured out how those boundaries intersect with their partner's boundaries. And then we also have a lot of other things coming out. Like, we have, I actually know a lot of youth who are talking about being polyamorous, which is fine. But that takes a lot of emotional maturity to negotiate and navigate. So it's, and I also see some of those youth experiencing an enormous amount of jealousy. And so we have to really encourage the youth that we work with, or the youth that we know, that like jealousy is a normal experience, and it feels like a boundary being crossed, right? But there are different ways to handle it. Yeah, Susanna is already doing this. This is great. Susanna says, getting mad at the partner for talking to another person and accusing them of flirting, right? So whether or not the partner is actually flirting, just talking to another person can really inspire jealousy, and then comes the accusations. So that's really toxic behavior. Emma, social media. Do you mean like going on to social media with with accusations, or can you? Okay. Yes, airing your stuff out on social media is a thing that happens quite a bit, and that can just cascade in its damage. Damage to lots of different relationships, and accusations upon accusations. So yeah, like not handling it, and that's a passive aggressive way of handling it, right? Going on social media to talk about it instead of really just talking to your partner, which is the assertive way of doing it.
Yeah, and I noticed Susanna wrote giving your partner the silent treatment because they're jealous of them going out with their girlfriends or friends in general. And I think that's something really important, is that jealousy in a relationship isn't just about other romantic people. It's not just thinking, oh, they're going to cheat on me or they're going to leave me for someone else. It's also, they're not giving me as much attention as I want. Like they would thinking, they'd rather spend time with their friends than me. They care about their friends more than me, which is why it's so important that we talk about healthy balances, where you have the right to spend time with your friends. You have the right to do your hobbies, to do your schoolwork, to have a complete full life outside of your partner. And they have their own right to do that too. Your relationship does not entitle you to all of their time and all of their energy.
Right. And that's what, that was the much easier way of talking about the boundaries that I mentioned earlier, that, like youth need to figure out what their own boundaries are, and then figure out how it's going to interact with someone else's. And somebody else's boundaries might include their friends. Whereas, one youth may not have, that may not include that. So what are some healthy behaviors around jealousy? What are healthy ways of handling jealousy? Yes, calmly talking it out, which takes an enormous amount of courage. Like, I don't want to downplay that. Like, it takes a lot of courage, especially if a youth comes from a family where speaking your mind or saying what you really feel has been punished. And so I really want to acknowledge that for some people that has not been a safe thing to do. And so like, it's super hard to talk things out. It's super difficult for some youth to let their partner know, like Susanna says, that they feel insecure, but also want to trust them. Like, having the words for those thoughts and those emotions and then being able to communicate them in such a calm way, that is absolutely, as Annie mentioned, that's a skill learned over time.
Yeah, and I also really like how Susanna talks like the I feel statements. And that's so important when we're talking about jealousy, because what you don't want to do is come in making an accusation. You don't want to say, I know that you're texting them because you like them. And or I know that you care about them more than me, because then you're already putting them on the defensive, and it's not going to produce a healthy conversation. One thing that I do let kids know, and I do talk about, is that if you do not trust your partner, if they're doing a behavior that is not okay, like maybe your girlfriend is having a sleepover at one of your male friends' houses on a regular basis, and you're just like, okay, I am so uncomfortable with this. It's not your job to say you're not allowed to do that anymore. You don't get to control her behavior, but you can say, if you want to continue in this relationship, I'm not comfortable with you doing that, and I'm going to end this relationship if you keep doing that. That's okay. You can end a relationship if your partner is doing things that are making you uncomfortable and that are not allowing you to trust them. But you don't get to say, I don't want you talking to these people. I don't want you texting people. I need to know where you're going at all times. I need to, you can't wear that. And that's a point where it gets so easy for jealousy to be used as a justification for controlling behaviors, when it might not even be about jealousy at all. At that point, it might just be about control.
Right. We have a really good comment here about realizing past relationships where cheating may have occurred should not be projected onto the current relationship. So bringing up old stuff and projecting it onto what's under the new relationship, you're right, is a huge thing. Like, we should absolutely learn from our mistakes. And that's again, that's a skill. That's a skill set. What is the difference between learning from our mistakes in the past and projecting our feelings of jealousy onto the next partner? That's a real difficult balance. And that's a balance that a lot of adults can't manage, much less a teenager in the midst of, hormonal whirlwinds.
Yeah, definitely. All right, we're a bit behind time, so we'll go through these ones a bit faster.
Okay. We thought this might happen.
Yeah, no, definitely prepared for it. So speed run now time. And we're going to talk about anxiety. So what are some toxic behaviors that might come from anxiety in a relationship? And the need for control.
Nice. Yes.
Texting or calling all the time, monitoring their actions closely.
Yep.
Yeah. And anxiety can be so frustrating in a relationship, because for some people, their urge, the more anxious they are about losing someone, and especially if they don't have a lot of people in their life, if they don't have parents that they can trust, or if they don't have a lot of friends, they might get a romantic partner, and that relationship can be so important and mean the world to them. And they might have so much at stake about not losing that relationship. And so they want to hold on to that person as tight as possible, not let them go. Any signs that they might leave them could trigger something in them, could trigger really deep anxiety. But then the closer they try to hold that person, the less happy that person is going to be. And the more they're going to feel like, this is too much. I can't handle this level of attachment here.
Right. And really the root of anxiety is the loss of control. And so what are some healthy behaviors around anxiety?
And while we're waiting, really quick, another unhealthy or another toxic thing could be. Sorry, I can't deal with silence apparently.
Okay.
Is that, some people might push their partner away if they're anxious because they don't want to lose them. And so there's that, well, you're going to leave me anyways, so I'm just going to push you away so you can't hurt me. And that can be
Yeah, the preemptive strike.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we have talking with a counselor and honest conversations. Yep. And exercise. Yeah.
Yeah.
That takes the physical energy out of it, right? Right. And Chris says, I found anxiety to be a bit of a barometer for outward facing needs. Showing vulnerability in a relationship. That's very courageous. Cultivating hobbies and interests outside the relationship. Yep. And really finding out what I would like to add, finding out what we can control. What can we control here? And the things that we can control are our own responses. And just recognizing that we're dealing with another human being with their own free will.
Yeah. That's hard.
It is hard.
They have no free will. They could do whatever they want. Not fair.
Inconceivable.
No way.
Right. All right. We're gonna move on because we still have a lot to cover. So we're going to talk about love, and you would think that love would not be a challenging emotion, but it's also probably the most challenging emotion, or one of the most challenging emotions. So what are some toxic behaviors? And I want to say like falling in love. Toxic behaviors around falling in love. I will start out, I'll do a seed one. One of the things that I see a lot with the youth that I work with is, the lack of boundaries, where like they are on the phone with each other all the time. They go to sleep with their video cameras on so they can watch each other fall asleep. They're on the phone constantly, 24/7 with this other person. And that's not a health. I mean, there's no boundaries there.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it reminds you someone's writing codependency in there, loss of self. Yep. And I love Susanna. Susanna, you've gotten so many great answers. I don't mean to keep calling you out here, but thinking and saying you're the only one for me and I can't live without your love. I think everyone says that in their first relationship, maybe. I don't know, but at least in their first few, because it's so like, oh, wow, I finally found someone who cares about me and we've got this great thing going on. And then
love bombing, yep.
Yeah.
Oh, love bombing is a huge one. And
then moving too fast in a relationship. Of just, you have such strong feelings of love for this person and you're thinking like, wow, this is great. You're, like, we've been together for 2 weeks. Let's make it official and let's tell everybody and let's plan the rest of our lives together, which can be harmless sometimes, it could be sweet, but if the other person isn't necessarily returning those feelings yet, it could be really overwhelming and a little bit scary for them too.
Yeah. I'm going to bring up Encanto again because I'm obsessed, but there's a great scene at the very end where this one character has been pining away for another character and has been largely ignored, and he finally acknowledges that like, oh, here's this wonderful person, and then moments later he's like, let's get married, and she who's been pining for him is like, slow down. So it was a really nice way of showing like, wait, no, we can have boundaries around this, like, and take our time. So glad that's in a kids movie too.
Okay, we have a little bit more to get by, so really quick, throw out some what are some toxic and some healthy, you could write like toxic colon, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
Yeah. Toxic colon behavior, healthy colon behavior. Yeah, so a toxic one was having sex with someone when you're too young in hopes that they love you.
I think that was for the last slide, but yes,
Oh,
I think that
yeah.
that is a really good point. Again, I'm going to call out media. Media, the sex is a shorthand for falling in love and for the process of love. But I think a lot of people get it confused. You know, if you can't recognize that it's shorthand, then it can be very confusing to watch. So yeah, that's a really, really good point.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, so hurt and heartbreak, which is prevalent. Some toxic and or healthy behaviors, you can just throw them out there.
One toxic behavior is refusing to accept the end of a relationship.
Right. And we just saw that play out, right?
Yeah.
With the example that Chris posted. Right.
And destruction of property.
Yeah. Or destruction of reputation, I will add to that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, like if you hurt me, I will ruin you, you know, kind of a thing.
Yeah, retaliation.
Going
on social media.
Yep. Again, yep. Social media is a huge tool for that, a potential tool for that.
And what about some healthy ones of dealing with heartbreak or hurt?
Yep, self-harm is another toxic one, where that frustration and grief, really, because that grief is at the heart of that, is turned inward. I think that I'll go ahead and cede the heartbroken one, that self-care is really important. That healing your own self, and yes, reconnecting with friends if you haven't had connection with your friends, that really establishing that network and feeling supported, but going through your own grief and just understanding that that's yours. That's a big one. All right, let's go race ahead.
Race through. We're just gonna talk through fear really quick. Tanya, no time for participation anymore. We don't want to hear it anymore. We got it.
We want to honor your time commitment.
That too. So unlike the other emotions, which we've been talking about, fear is not one that we want to say, oh, that's normal, that's fine. You should not be feeling afraid in your relationship. If a teen or anyone tells you that they're afraid of their partner, that's a really serious red flag, that something might be going on, that there might be abuse happening. So in general, there tend to be 5 responses to fear, which I will let Tanya go over.
So we have heard over and over again throughout for the last few decades, I think, fight or flight, right? But lately we've added a few more to these, and that's freeze, where you can't fight and you can't run. So freeze means to just exactly that. And then fawn, which is also known as appease, right? So to please the other person so that they won't hurt you. And then the last one is dissociate. And that is when you kind of just check out, right? And honestly, we'll talk about the animal world for a second. In the predator-prey experience, they've shown that when a prey animal is hunted, that just as they are being brought down, they dissociate. And they just kind of like relax. It's almost like accepting the fate of what's happening, accepting the inevitability of what's happening. And they just kind of already go away in their minds. And we can't verify that for sure, but that's what the observations are looking at. There's this almost resignation. And so we really want to, we've seen that a lot with trafficked youth. And I've worked a bit with trafficked youth as well. And so there's this dissociation that happens where like, I can't, this feeling is too overwhelming and I'm just going to put myself over here. And just let the inevitability of what's happening happen. So that's what we mean by dissociate. And any of these are red flags, right? I just really want to emphasize that. And I think we're going to go ahead and move to, if you hear about any of these red flags, or if anybody experiences these red flags that you know, that particularly our young people who don't have as many resources as adults, that it's important to get them some support. If a teen particularly reveals that they're afraid of their partner.
And absolutely letting them know that it's not okay. That in a healthy relationship, you should never be scared. And if another thing to do is giving them resources. If they come and talk to you saying like, I'm afraid of my partner when he gets upset, then the National Teen Dating Violence Hotline is a really good resource. I have the number right there. And loveisrespect.org is another really good resource that has information about teen relationships. Yeah, so that is all we have for you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya, for being here. You made it a very, very fun webinar. Probably my favorite one so far. And as always, if you are in immediate danger or if you're worried about someone you can call the DVS hotline at 425-252-2873 or abuse. And we're a great resource. I don't know if you want to put in a quick word for Cocoon House, Tanya?
Yeah, so you can find Cocoon House at cocoonhouse.org. And then also, I work for Compass Health as well. So if you or anybody has Medicaid and wants to access community mental health, if they don't feel like they don't have the resources to get mental health support, they can still get it at Compass Health. And that is compassh.org. I'm trying to think of how my email ends. But you can also call 425-349-8200.
Was that 425-349-8200?
Correct.
Okay. 42. Sorry, repeat it one more time.
425-349.
349.
8200.
8200. Okay.
Right, and that's for Compass Health. And then Cocoon House is, I'll see if I can put it in the chat in the 1.5 minutes that we have left. 425. 25. I think that's it. Oops. Oh, yeah, that's Compass. 25. There we go. And there's a menu that you would listen to. There are advocates for youth at Cocoon House as well. And there are also housing programs and things that can help. So there are a lot of resources at Cocoon. Sorry, I get them confused all the time. So I have a foot in both worlds. But thanks everyone for joining us.
And
thank you, Annie.